coherent or incoherent. Let me get back to that. The next thing we find in this is that the fields of the Earth, forming these great embracing fields from each of the poles, mesh with the fields of the heart if the heart is coherent. The fields of the Earth have always been coherent until very recently, but something has happened. Here's a picture that NASA took from a satellite, an electromagnetic image of the Earth itself. And here's what that satellite image of the Earth looked like. And here we find exactly the same thing. The fields coming out, the color coding showing at a different amplitude from each of the poles, swirling out around, forming this great torus form, which embraces the whole planet. And we'll talk about what a torus form is in just a minute. But if you see these great arcs coming out, these are going to go all the way out and fuse with the solar system's own fields that it sends out. And here are many of these arcs or torus forms that only come partially and back in and out, in and out on a wider and wider level. Now we'll talk about the rest of this in a minute when we get to it. Let's just stick to that much for the time being. These fields from the heart, from the Earth, for one thing, they match what we find in the fields coming from the heart. The only thing is, they're bigger, to say the least. Now the next thing was the discovery that these forms are found coming out of the sun. The very first picture we had of this was, I don't have a color coding of it, but you'll see exactly the same thing. These swirls of energy, here they call them plasma. They're like huge, incredible rivers of pure electromagnetic power coming out of the sun, curving around and back in on wider and wider levels, and then here are these that go out to embrace the entire solar system. That was nothing like the one we had given us by NASA on January 14th, 2004, I think. From Earth, from electromagnetic images taken from Earth of the sun. And look at it. This is, when I saw this, I bowed and genuflected toward Rome and whatever. This was, I took off my shoes. We were on sacred territory. Look at these fields coming out of the sun. They're perfectly coherent, every one of them. There's nothing incoherent in all. It looks like a great scramble. No, look carefully. Each one is a perfectly coherent, curving out, back in, wider and wider levels. And here again, the color coding showing a different frequency coming from this side than from this side of the sun itself, and moving out and embracing the whole solar system. So what do we find? We find the very same pattern that is emerging from our heart and holding our whole body within its embrace, simply repeated over and over on ever. We say larger forms, but once you get into this, that kind of scalar measurement is pointless. There's no bigger and smaller. There is simply, what are you going to do with this kind of a relationship? And of course, we find that underlying this is the whole creative process. This is how things are. And the fact that our fields mesh and merge with the fields of the Earth and they in turn mesh and merge with the fields of the sun to the extent that we are within our own life, within our own body and mind, coherent. We are automatically what? What? We're automatically simply part of that whole structure. We contain it all within us, and we participate with it in the same way. Now that brings me up to the point where we need to discuss the actual shapes that this field coming out of the heart forms. That shape is what is called a torus. Let's just glance at this computer simulation of a torus and get into what we mean. Notice that it comes out, around, and back in. And then on wider and wider and wider levels. And the same thing, of course, with the earth. Now, what forms is a figure called a torus. And I'm going to borrow here from David Bohm, the great physicist, his term holonomic. The first thing we find about the torus coming out of our heart is it's holonomic. Since it's holonomic, it would be impossible to take a piece of it out. But if you could, you would find that the tiniest part of this holonomic measurement contains the information of the totality. The closest thing we have is holographic photography. You've probably heard of holographic photography. And it's an exciting thing when you first see it. They used to make photographs on a glass plate. You put that emulsion, what is the silver nitrate or something like that, emulsion on a plate of glass to make pictures back in the, what would they call them, daguerreotype? Yeah, thank you. I won't repeat it. In fact, in my grandmother's attic, I found a whole box of these plates, these glass plates. It was one of my favorite uncle's pastimes, is making these, and that's all they had. Just before celluloid was invented and used for film. Now, the thing about holographic filming is the use of this. Well, no need to go into the mechanics of it since I don't understand them. But it's simply the different positioning of two sources of light coming into the film. Any part of it contains the image of the whole. And you can take a holographic photograph on a plate and break the plate into all these different fragments. Any tiny fragment contains the image of the totality. Now, the smaller the fragment, the more difficult it is to bring it into clarity, but it can always be done with the appropriate work on it, machinery, and so forth and so on. Do you understand what I'm saying about that? The holographic plate contains the image. Break it into all the pieces you can think of. Each fragment contains the image. But the smaller the fragment, the fuzzier the image. And you have to use the same process that you made in the beginning to bring the clarity out of that little image. Got that? Now, therein also lies the whole secret of what things are about with us. It's a beautiful example. Holonomic. That's the torus. The second thing about the torus that the heart produces, it seems to be almost, once set into motion, almost self-generative. And they call it the most stable energy form that you can have. Stable meaning once set into motion of that torus form, it tends to self-replicate. It